What if one of the most dangerous nuclear plans in history was hidden not in a desert, not in a silo, but beneath miles of Arctic ice, in a place the world believed was nothing more than a frozen wilderness? What if, while the public saw scientific research and peaceful cooperation, an entirely different mission was unfolding in total secrecy? As you listen to this story, leave a comment with your thoughts, because few Cold War operations reveal the lengths nations were willing to go to as clearly as this one. If this kind of hidden history interests you, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your opinion in the comments, because stories like this were buried on purpose, and remembering them depends on people who choose to listen. At the height of the Cold War, fear shaped every major decision made by the United States and the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons were no longer theoretical threats. They were real, ready, and capable of ending civilization within hours. American military planners believed that survival depended on the ability to strike first, strike fast, and strike from places the enemy would never expect. Greenland, an immense landmass locked in ice and snow, suddenly became far more than a remote Arctic territory. It became a strategic shield between North America and the Soviet Union, a silent buffer where secrets could be hidden far from prying eyes. Publicly, the American presence in Greenland appeared benign. Bases were described as early warning stations and research outposts, designed to study polar conditions and monitor potential Soviet bomber routes. Privately, however, military engineers and strategists saw the ice itself as a weapon. Beneath the frozen surface lay an environment that satellites could not yet fully penetrate, an unstable but concealing mass that could hide entire cities if necessary. The idea was radical. Instead of placing nuclear missiles in fixed silos that could be mapped and targeted, why not hide them under the ice and constantly move them, making a first strike almost impossible to prevent? This concept became known as Project Iceworm. Its goal was breathtaking in scale and terrifying in implication. The plan envisioned a network of thousands of kilometers of tunnels carved directly into the Greenland ice sheet, housing up to 600 nuclear missiles. These weapons would be mounted on mobile launch platforms, capable of being repositioned constantly, ensuring that no enemy could ever know their exact location. From this frozen labyrinth, missiles could be launched toward the Soviet Union with little warning, fundamentally altering the balance of nuclear power. Before such an ambitious plan could ever be approved, the United States needed proof that it was even possible. Ice is not rock. It moves, cracks, compresses, and shifts under its own weight. To test whether humans could live, work, and operate complex machinery beneath the ice for long periods, the Army Corps of Engineers proposed an experimental base. This base would have a harmless explanation, something that would not raise suspicion among allies or the international community. Thus, Camp Century was born. Construction began in the late 1950s under conditions that pushed technology and human endurance to their limits. Engineers cut trenches into the ice using massive snow cutters, then covered them with arched roofs and packed snow on top, creating underground corridors protected from the brutal Arctic winds. Inside these tunnels, they built sleeping quarters, laboratories, storage rooms, and command areas. To power the base, the Army installed a portable nuclear reactor, an unprecedented decision that allowed Camp Century to operate independently in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Officially, Camp Century was a scientific triumph. Journalists were invited, photographs were released, reports spoke of groundbreaking research into ice dynamics, climate conditions, and human survival in extreme cold. Few questioned why such an advanced facility was needed in such a remote location. Fewer still asked why the tunnels extended farther than research alone would ever require. Behind locked doors and classified briefings, data from Camp Century was being analyzed for a very different reason: to determine whether the ice could support the future deployment of nuclear missiles. What made this operation even more sensitive was the political reality. Greenland belonged to the Kingdom of Denmark, a nation that publicly opposed the placement of nuclear weapons on its territory. While Denmark was a member of the Western Alliance, it had not given formal approval for nuclear missiles to be stationed beneath its ice. American officials relied on ambiguity, secrecy, and carefully worded agreements, ensuring that the true scope of the project remained hidden even from close allies. As life continued underground at Camp Century, scientists and soldiers began to notice troubling signs. Tunnel walls slowly warped, ceilings sagged under pressure. Doors that once closed smoothly became difficult to open. The ice was alive, shifting constantly, and it did not behave as the planners had hoped. Every measurement taken, every crack observed, raised a silent question that would soon become impossible to ignore, setting the stage for decisions that could no longer remain hidden beneath the ice. Beneath the surface of Camp Century, the ice never truly rested. Day by day, instruments recorded subtle movements that revealed an uncomfortable truth. The Greenland ice sheet behaved less like a stable foundation and more like a slow, relentless river. Tunnels that were straight during construction gradually bent out of alignment. Support beams required constant adjustment. Snow and ice crept inward, narrowing corridors that had once allowed vehicles to pass with ease. These changes were not sudden disasters, but they were constant, and constancy was the real enemy of a project that depended on long-term stability. For the engineers overseeing Project Iceworm, this created a race against time. Every calculation assumed that maintenance could keep pace with the ice's movement. Crews shaved walls, raised ceilings, and reinforced structures, but the effort demanded manpower, resources, and energy far beyond initial projection. What was meant to be a proof of concept began to resemble a warning. If a single experimental base required such effort to remain functional, what would it take to maintain hundreds of missile launch sites spread across thousands of kilometers beneath the ice? At the same time, the nuclear reactor powering Camp Century introduced another layer of risk. While it allowed the base to function independently, it also required strict safety protocols in an environment where mechanical failure could quickly turn catastrophic. Radioactive waste, cooling water, and contaminated materials were managed under the assumption that the ice would act as a permanent tomb, isolating them from the outside world. This assumption was rarely questioned at the time, because the Cold War mindset prioritized immediate strategic advantage over distant consequences. Above ground, geopolitics continued to evolve. Advances in reconnaissance technology slowly eroded the secrecy that projects like Iceworm depended upon. Spy satellites became more capable, missile detection systems improved, and the concept of mutually assured destruction began to reshape nuclear strategy. Fixed missile sites, even hidden ones, seemed increasingly vulnerable in a world where retaliation was guaranteed. The strategic logic that had given birth to Iceworm was no longer as unassailable as it once appeared. Within classified reports, doubts became harder to ignore. Analysts concluded that the ice sheet's movement was not just an engineering inconvenience, but a fundamental flaw. Missile launch tracks would deform, guidance systems could be misaligned, emergency access routes might collapse without warning. In a scenario where seconds mattered, the unpredictability of ice could turn a weapon into a liability. The frozen shield that was meant to protect the missiles threatened to trap them instead. The political risks were equally severe. Any public revelation that the United States had planned to deploy nuclear weapons beneath Greenland without Denmark's explicit consent would cause diplomatic fallout. Trust within the Western alliance could fracture. Neutral nations might see the operation as proof that nuclear powers could not be trusted to respect sovereignty. What had once been an advantage of secrecy now became a vulnerability that could not be fully controlled. By the early 1960s, the tone surrounding Project Iceworm shifted decisively. What began as visionary planning transformed into damage control. Camp Century remained operational, but its role quietly changed. Data collection continued, but the dream of a vast underground missile network faded behind closed doors. Official explanations still spoke of research and experimentation, but the strategic heart of the project was already slowing to a stop. Eventually, the decision was made to abandon the experiment. The nuclear reactor was dismantled and removed, the base evacuated, and the tunnels left to the ice. No public announcement marked the end of Iceworm. There was no acknowledgement of failure, no admission of how close the world had come to a hidden nuclear frontier beneath the Arctic. The ice closed in, sealing corridors and crushing structures, as if erasing the evidence of human ambition. Yet what was left behind did not disappear. Beneath the frozen surface remained construction materials, fuel residues, and radioactive waste, all entombed under layers of snow and ice that planners believed would never melt. For decades, Camp Century became a forgotten footnote, known only to historians and declassified documents. But the ice, once again, was moving, and the silence surrounding what lay beneath it could not last forever. For many years after Camp Century was abandoned, the world moved on, and the secrets buried beneath Greenland's ice seemed safely locked away by distance, cold, and time. Declassified documents slowly surfaced, but they attracted little public attention. The Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and nuclear fears took on new forms. What remained largely unnoticed was that the assumptions made in the 1960s about the permanence of the ice were beginning to fail. Scientific research in the late 20th and early 21st century revealed that the Greenland ice sheet was far more dynamic than previously understood. Rising global temperatures accelerated surface melting, altering the balance that had kept deep layers frozen and stable. What had once been considered a permanent, frozen vault was now recognized as an evolving system, capable of transporting water, chemicals, and debris through channels no one had anticipated when Project Iceworm was conceived. As climate scientists studied ice cores and melt patterns, Camp Century re-emerged as more than a historical curiosity. Reports confirmed that thousands of tons of abandoned material remained trapped beneath the ice, including diesel fuel, industrial waste, and low-level radioactive contamination. None of it had been designed for retrieval. The belief at the time was simple and dangerously confident. The ice would entomb everything forever. Now, that certainty no longer existed. The reappearance of Camp Century and modern scientific discussions forced uncomfortable questions. If melting continued, where would the waste go? How long before it reached the surface or entered surrounding ecosystems? And perhaps most troubling of all, who was responsible for a problem created in secrecy, on foreign territory, decades earlier? These questions had no easy answers because the project itself had never been fully acknowledged in public discourse. Diplomatically, the issue reopened old wounds. Denmark, which had long maintained a policy against nuclear weapons on its soil, faced renewed scrutiny over what it had known and when. Internal records suggested that Danish officials had been aware of American nuclear activities in Greenland to some extent, but the full scale of Project Iceworm had not been formally approved. What had once been a quiet compromise between allies now risked becoming a public controversy, shaped by modern environmental concerns rather than Cold War fears. For the United States, Camp Century became a symbol of a broader pattern in Cold War strategy. Extreme solutions were pursued under extreme pressure, often with little consideration for long-term consequences. The idea of hiding hundreds of nuclear missiles under ice was not born from madness, but from a rational fear of vulnerability in an era where a single miscalculation could mean annihilation. Understanding this context does not excuse the risks, but it explains how such a plan could move from imagination to near execution. Historians began to reassess Project Iceworm as a turning point in military thinking. It represented both the peak of confidence in human engineering and the moment when nature quietly asserted its limits. Ice, unlike concrete or steel, refused to obey long-term designs. It shifted, flowed, and ultimately defeated a plan that depended on rigidity and predictability. In this sense, Iceworm was less a failure of technology than a failure of assumptions. The story also highlighted the gap between public narratives and classified reality. While citizens were told of scientific progress and peaceful research, preparations for unprecedented nuclear deployment were underway just below their feet. This disconnect fueled modern skepticism toward official explanations, reminding future generations that transparency was often sacrificed in the name of national security. As awareness of Camp Century spread beyond academic circles, it became clear that its legacy was still unfolding. What had been left beneath the ice was no longer just a relic of the Cold War, but a potential environmental hazard tied directly to decisions made in secrecy. The frozen ground that once promised invisibility was slowly transforming into a messenger, carrying the consequences of those decisions toward the surface and toward a world forced to confront what had been hidden for so long. As the implications of Camp Century became clearer, the story shifted from one of military ambition to one of accountability. What had once been framed as a daring experiment in Arctic engineering was now viewed through the lens of environmental responsibility and international law. Scientists, policymakers, and historians began to recognize that Project Iceworm was not only a relic of Cold War paranoia, but also an unresolved issue that modern generations had inherited without consent. Environmental models suggested that, if warming trends continued, meltwater could eventually reach the layers where waste from Camp Century was buried. Diesel fuel, chemical residues, and radioactive byproducts, long assumed to be safely frozen in place, might be released into surrounding ice and water systems. While this would not happen overnight, the timeline was no longer measured in geological eternity, but in decades. The slow movement of ice meant that contamination, once mobilized, could spread far from its original source. This realization placed Denmark in a complex position. Greenland, while part of the Danish realm, had gained greater autonomy over the years, and local authorities demanded clarity about risks imposed without their involvement. The issue was no longer just about Cold War history, but about sovereignty, environmental justice, and the rights of communities living near the Arctic environment. For many in Greenland, Camp Century became a symbol of decisions made far away, by powers that would never bear the consequences directly. The United States, for its part, acknowledged the historical existence of Camp Century, but stopped short of accepting full responsibility for its long-term environmental impact. Legal ambiguity complicated every discussion. Agreements signed during the Cold War were vague, classified, or interpreted differently by each side. Determining who should monitor, clean up, or pay for potential remediation became a diplomatic puzzle with no clear precedent. Beyond the legal and environmental concerns, the psychological impact of the revelation was significant. The idea that hundreds of nuclear missiles were once planned to be hidden beneath the ice challenged public perceptions of the Cold War as a distant, abstract struggle. It underscored how close the world had come to normalizing nuclear weapons in places never meant to host them. Greenland was not a battlefield, yet it was nearly transformed into one of the most heavily armed regions on Earth, without its people ever being told. Project Iceworm also forced a re-evaluation of military secrecy itself. While secrecy can protect national security, it can also delay accountability. The absence of public debate meant that ethical, environmental, and political risks were never fully examined at the time. Decisions were made by a small group of planners operating under intense pressure, insulated from the broader consequences their actions might create decades later. In academic circles, Iceworm became a case study in the limits of technological optimism. The belief that engineering could overcome any natural obstacle proved flawed when confronted with the slow, unstoppable behavior of ice. The project demonstrated that even the most advanced military powers remain subject to forces beyond their control. Nature did not need to oppose the plan directly. It simply continued to move, gradually rendering the entire concept unworkable. As attention turned toward the future, one question loomed over every discussion. What should be done now? Some argued for proactive monitoring and eventual cleanup, while others warned that disturbing the site could create more harm than leaving it untouched. The uncertainty reflected a broader truth about Cold War legacies. Many of them were never designed to be resolved in a world that would one day outgrow the fears that created them. The frozen silence beneath Greenland had preserved the remains of Project Iceworm for decades, but silence was no longer an option. As climate, politics, and public awareness converged, the buried past began to demand answers, drawing the world closer to a reckoning that could no longer be postponed. Today, Camp Century stands as a stark reminder of how fear can drive nations to the edges of imagination and beyond. What began as a strategic calculation during the most tense years of the Cold War evolved into a hidden legacy that still raises questions in the present. The plan to conceal hundreds of nuclear missiles beneath Greenland's ice was never fully realized, yet its partial execution was enough to leave a permanent mark on history, science, and international relations. Modern assessments suggest that the site remains largely sealed by ice, but for how long remains uncertain. Climate projections indicate that surface melting in Greenland is accelerating, changing the internal structure of the ice sheet in ways that Cold War planners could not have foreseen. The waste left behind at Camp Century was never intended to be managed over centuries. It was abandoned under the assumption of eternal cold, an assumption now challenged by measurable change rather than speculation. For Greenlanders, The story of Camp Century has become intertwined with broader debates about autonomy and historical justice. Decisions that affected their land were made without their voice, justified by global security concerns that offered them no protection and no benefit. As Greenland continues to define its role in the modern world, Camp Century remains a symbol of why transparency and consent matter, even in matters of defense. From a strategic perspective, Project Iceworm reveals the mindset of an era when nuclear deterrence overshadowed every other concern. The willingness to hide weapons of unprecedented destructive power beneath a foreign ice sheet illustrates how normalized the unthinkable had become. The project was not an anomaly, but part of a global pattern in which survival was measured in megatons and minutes, not generations. The irony is unavoidable. The ice that was meant to conceal and protect the missiles ultimately defeated the plan, while the consequences of that defeat linger far longer than the strategy itself. Iceworm failed as a military system, but succeeded as a lesson in unintended consequences. It demonstrated that secrecy can delay exposure, but it cannot erase responsibility. As more documents are declassified and scientific research continues, the full story of Camp Century continues to emerge. Each revelation adds nuance to a narrative that is no longer just about hidden missiles, but about the intersection of power, environment, and ethics. It forces a reconsideration of how modern societies judge past decisions made under existential threat. The question that remains is not only how the United States managed to hide such an ambitious plan beneath Greenland without the world knowing, but what it means now that the world does know. The legacy of Project Iceworm challenges us to confront the long shadows cast by Cold War choices, and to recognize that even the most carefully buried secrets can resurface. In the end, the tunnels beneath the ice may collapse, and the structures of Camp Century may be crushed into obscurity, but the story itself endures. It endures as a warning, a historical reckoning, and a reminder that the consequences of secrecy do not melt away as easily as ice.